All right, so have you ever stopped to think about just how many bacteria are hanging out in your mouth right now?
Probably not something you want to dwell on too much.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But seriously, the number's pretty mind-blowing, 50 to 100 billion. That's like more people than on the entire planet all living in your oral cavity.
Crazy, right?
It is. And that's what we're diving into today. The fascinating world of the oral microbiome.
It's not just a bunch of random germs. This is an incredibly complex community of microorganisms, and there's so much we're still learning about it.
Exactly. We've got some great sources to guide us today.
Yeah, a practical guide to the oral microbiome and its relation to health and disease from PMC gives a really solid scientific overview.
Perfect. And though we've also got the oral microbiome, an update for oral healthcare professionals from the British Dental Journal, which, as the name suggests, brings in that clinical perspective.
So we'll be covering all the bases for you today.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to go beyond just acknowledging that, yes, there are bacteria in your mouth. We want to really understand the sheer numbers and diversity of these microbes, where they prefer to hang out in your mouth, and how this whole microscopic world connects to both oral and overall health.
Buckle up, because you might be surprised by some of what we uncover.
Totally. So let's start with the numbers. How many different types of bacteria are we talking about here?
Well, the current estimates, based on the Human Oral Microbe Database, HOMD, suggest there are around 700 predominant bacterial species in the oral cavity.
700. That's incredible.
And get this, over 30% of them are what we call uncultivables, or phylotypes. Basically, these are distinct bacteria we can identify through their DNA, but haven't yet figured out how to grow in a lab.
Wow, so we're just scratching the surface of understanding this hidden world.
Exactly. And to add to the complexity, you've got to consider that the mouth isn't one uniform environment.
Right, it's like a city with different neighborhoods.
Precisely. Each area, your tongue, teeth, cheeks, palate, even your tonsils and lips, hosts distinct microbial communities.
That's wild. So tell me, what kind of differences are we talking about?
Well, for example, Rothia species are often found on the tongue and teeth, while Simonsiella seems to prefer the hard palate.
Huh, interesting.
And then you have Streptococcus salivarius, a major resident of the tongue, and treponemes, which are spiral-shaped bacteria, tend to be more abundant in the subgingival crevice, that little space between your teeth and gums.
It really is like each area has its own specialized residence.
Absolutely. And these residents, or should we say tenants, can have a big impact on your health.
Obviously, we all know some oral bacteria are linked to things like cavities and gum disease.
Right, and the science is pretty clear on that.
Yeah.
Specific bacteria have been associated with a whole range of oral health issues, actually.
Like what?
Well, you've got dental caries, obviously, but also various periodontal diseases that affect your gums and the supporting structures of your teeth, endodontic lesions, which are infections in the root canals, even dry socket and halitosis.
Oh, yeah. Nobody wants bad breath.
Definitely not. And it can even get more serious with odontogenic infections, which can sometimes spread beyond the mouth.
See, this is why I brush and floss, people.
Okay.
But okay, this is where things get really interesting for me. I've heard that oral bacteria might even be linked to problems in other parts of the body. Is there any truth to that?
It's definitely an area of intense research right now.
So that's the latest.
Well, some studies are showing that certain oral bacteria could act as biomarkers for systemic diseases.
Meaning they could be early warning signs of other health issues.
Exactly. We're talking about things like pancreatic cancer, type 2 diabetes, pediatric Crohn's disease, heart disease, and even links to low birth weight and preterm birth.
So by analyzing someone's oral microbiome, we might be able to detect these conditions earlier.
That's the hope, and the potential is certainly there. But it's important to note that we haven't established a definite cause and effect relationship yet. It's more about associations and exploring possibilities at this point.
Gotcha. But even just identifying those associations is pretty huge. Now, I'm curious, how do scientists even begin to study something so complex? I mean, we're talking about billions of tiny organisms.
Right. It wouldn't be possible without some incredible advances in technology, particularly in the areas of sequencing and bioinformatics.
Sequencing, like reading the DNA of these bacteria.
Exactly. And bioinformatics is basically using specialized software to analyze all that data. One of the biggest game changers has been the Human Microbiome Project, or HMP.
I've heard of that, but refresh my memory. What was it all about?
Well, it was a massive effort to characterize the microbial communities in different parts of the human body, including 7 sites in the mouth, all from healthy individuals.
So they were trying to establish a baseline for what a healthy oral microbiome looks like.
Precisely. And one of the key findings was just how much variation there is between individuals.
Makes sense. Everyone's mouth is a bit different.
Absolutely. And another interesting thing they found is that your ethnic and racial background can influence the types of bacteria you have.
Wow, so our microbiome is even connected to our ancestry in a way.
Yeah.
So is that where the Human Oral Microbe Database, HOMD, comes in?
Exactly. HOMD is a curated database that focuses specifically on those approximately 700 predominant oral bacteria we talked about.
So it's like a comprehensive directory of all the usual suspects.
Exactly. And it's not just a list of names. It links their genetic sequences with all sorts of information, like their biological characteristics, where they're typically found, and any known associations with health or disease.
Super helpful for researchers, I imagine.
Hmm.
So when scientists take a sample from someone's mouth, how do they actually identify which bacteria are present?
Well, one of the most commonly used methods is called 16S RNA gene sequencing.
Okay, break that down for me.
So all bacteria have this 16S rRNA gene, which is like a fingerprint. It has parts that are the same across all bacteria and parts that are unique to each species.
I
Scientists use special primers, which are like little DNA tags, to target those conserved regions and make copies of the gene from a sample. Then they sequence those copies and compare them to databases to identify the bacteria.
Clever. So that's one way to get a snapshot of the microbial community. Are there any other techniques?
Oh, absolutely. Next generation sequencing, or NGS, has been revolutionary.
I've heard that term thrown around a lot. What's so special about it?
It allows for massive parallel sequencing, meaning you can sequence millions or even billions of DNA fragments simultaneously.
Talk about efficiency.
Right. It's significantly faster and can handle way more data than older methods. There are various NGS platforms out there like 4v4 pyrosequencing, Illumina's MISEQ and HiSeq, PacBio, and Oxford Nanopore's Minion.
So many options. But I imagine all that data can be overwhelming. How do researchers make sense of it?
That's where bioinformatics comes in. For 16S rDNA profiling, a popular tool is QUIME, which stands for Quantitative Insights into Microbial Ecology.
Catchy.
Right. Basically, QUIME takes those raw sequencing reads and groups similar sequences together into what we call operational taxonomic units, or OTUs. Then it tries to match those OTUs to known bacterial species in databases.
So it's like sorting and identifying all those little DNA snippets.
Precisely. Often we can identify bacteria down to the genus level, but sometimes we can even get to the species level.
Wow, that's impressive. I also came across something called homings. What's that all about?
Ah, yes. Homings, which stands for Human Oral Microbe Identification using next-generation sequencing, is a newer method that can often achieve species-level identification for many oral bacteria.
So even more precise.
Yep. It uses a technique called ProbeSeq, which basically involves designing specific DNA probes that target unique sequences in known oral bacteria.
So it's like having a customized set of tags for all those bacteria.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool for getting a really detailed picture of the oral microbiome.
So we're getting good at figuring out who's there, but what about understanding what they're doing?
Ah, that's where metatranscriptomics comes in. It's a technique that analyzes the RNA in a sample.
Remind me, what's the difference between DNA and RNA again?
Well, DNA is like the blueprint, the genetic code, while RNA carries out those instructions, actually makes things happen.
Got it.
So by looking at the RNA, we can figure out which genes are being expressed and what metabolic processes are happening in the microbial community.
So we can understand how those bacteria are functioning and interacting with each other.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground about the diversity and complexity of the oral microbiome. But let's talk about what a healthy oral microbiome actually looks like. How does it develop over time?
Well, it all starts at birth. The initial colonization of the mouth is heavily influenced by the mother's microbiome.
So we inherit our first microbes from mom.
Exactly. Early colonizers, like certain Streptococcus species, play a big role in shaping the environment, making it suitable for other bacteria to come in later.
It's like setting up the stage for a bigger party.
I like that analogy. And over time, this leads to the development of a more stable and diverse climax community in adulthood.
So is there a core group of bacteria that's typically found in healthy mouths?
Yes, studies have shown that there's a sort of healthy core microbiome, which includes general like Streptococcus, Granulocytella, Neisseria, Haemophilus, and others.
But even with this core group, there's still a lot of individual variation, right?
Absolutely. Everyone's microbiome is unique, just like a fingerprint. But what's really fascinating is that this microbial community isn't just passively existing there, it's actively interacting with our bodies and playing a role in our health.
Like they're part of us, almost like another organ.
Exactly. It's a symbiotic relationship where both we and our microbes benefit. The concept of the holobiont even considers us and our microbes as a single integrated unit. And this coevolution has been going on for millions of years, even influencing differences in microbial profiles between ethnic groups.
That's wild. So what keeps this delicate balance in check?
Well, our bodies have several mechanisms for maintaining a healthy oral microbiome. Saliva and gingival crevicular fluid, or GCF, contain antimicrobial components that help regulate bacterial growth. Saliva also provides nutrients and helps regulate the environment.
And what about the microbes themselves? Do they play a role in keeping things balanced?
Definitely. The interactions and communication signals within the biofilm itself also contribute to stability. And then there's the acquired pellicle, a thin film that forms on teeth, which modulates bacterial attachment and protects enamel.
It's like a delicate ecosystem with checks and balances. But what happens when things go wrong?
That's when we talk about dysbiosis, which is essentially a disruption of the balance in the oral microbiome.
And that's linked to all those oral health problems we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And it's not always about being infected with new bacteria. It's often about changes in the environment that favor the growth of certain bacteria, often at the expense of the good guys.
Ah, I see. So it's like an ecological shift within the mouth.
Precisely. The ecological plaque hypothesis describes this phenomenon. It suggests that changes in the oral environment, like increased sugar intake, can lead to a more acidic environment that favors the growth of acid-producing bacteria, leading to cavities.
And what about gum disease? How does dysbiosis play a role there?
Well, the accumulation of biofilm and inflammation creates an environment that favors anaerobic bacteria and those that thrive on breaking down proteins. The increased flow of nutrients in inflamed gums further fuels their growth.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
It can be, unfortunately. And in periodontitis, we often see an increase in certain bacteria like Porphyromonas gingivalis, Tannerella forsythia, and Aggregatibacter actinomycetum comitans.
And then there's that red complex I've heard about.
Yes, the red complex consists of P. gingivalis, T. forsythia, and Treponema denticola. They're particularly associated with severe periodontitis and often depend on the earlier colonization by bacteria in the orange complex.
It's like a whole hierarchy of bacteria.
Yeah.
And what about those tricky cases of refractory periodontitis where treatment doesn't seem to work?
Research suggests that those cases often involve not only the usual suspects, but also other bacteria not commonly seen in more treatable forms of periodontitis, like P. lactolyticus, Gravendomonas diminuta, and Mycoplasma salivarium. There's even been some research on the potential role of Actinidobacter baumannii, a bacterium known for its resistance to antibiotics.
So those cases are even more complex. And what about aggressive periodontitis, which tends to affect younger people?
While Aggregatibacter actinomycetum comitans has been linked to aggressive periodontitis, the overall microbial community can sometimes resemble that of chronic periodontitis, but with higher levels of certain species like Filofactor allosis and various Tannerella species. There's even a potential biomarker consortium consisting of A. actinomycetum comitans, Streptococcus parasanguinis, and Filofactor allosis that might help predict bone loss.
So many different players in this microscopic world. Now let's talk about cavities. Is Streptococcus mutans really the only bad guy?
Well, S. mutans is definitely a major player, producing lactic acid and thriving in acidic environments. However, other bacteria are involved too, like Adipobium, Propionibacterium, and Lactobacillus. And some people develop cavities without even having detectable S. mutants, suggesting other acid-producing bacteria can also be culprits.
So it's not as simple as we might think.
Right. Studies have even shown differences in the microbiomes of populations with low and high caries rates. For example, those with better oral health tend to have lower levels of S. mutans and S. sabrinus and higher levels of actinomyces and Prevotella.
Fascinating. So each type of oral problem seems to have its own microbial signature. What about deeper infections like odontogenic infections and endodontic lesions?
You're right, each has its own profile. Odontogenic infections are often dominated by anaerobic bacteria like Fusobacterium species and Parvomonas micra, with a notable absence of Streptococcus.
Huh, interesting.
Primary endodontic infections have a mix of anaerobic bacteria, including Peptostreptococcus, P. micra, and various Prevotella and Treponema species. Enterococcus vitalis is usually present in lower numbers in these cases. However, in persistent or recurring infections requiring retreatment, E. faecalis often becomes dominant.
It's like it takes advantage of the situation.
Exactly. And then you have endodontic periodontal lesions, which involve both the root canal and surrounding gum tissues. These have a mix of bacteria from both types of infections.
So complex. But we've touched on this before, and I want to go back to it. Can this dysbiosis in the mouth affect other parts of the body?
There's increasing evidence suggesting a link between oral dysbiosis and systemic diseases like bacterial endocarditis, ischemic stroke, cardiovascular disease, pancreatic cancer, pediatric Crohn's disease, and even pneumonia.
So this tiny world in our mouths can have far-reaching consequences.
It appears so. Chronic inflammation from periodontal disease is thought to be one potential mechanism linking it to cardiovascular problems.
And some specific oral pathogens can even trigger systemic inflammation.
Yes, like Aggregatibacter, Actinomycetum comitans, and Prevotella intermedia. They release pro-inflammatory molecules that might even be able to cross the blood-brain barrier.
That's a bit scary.
It highlights the importance of oral health for overall well-being. And one particularly interesting area of research is the role of oral bacteria in nitric oxide homeostasis.
Nitric oxide, that's important for blood vessels and blood pressure, right?
Exactly. And it turns out that oral bacteria play a key role in converting dietary nitrates into nitrates, which can then be converted to nitric oxide in the body.
So our oral microbiome could be helping our cardiovascular system.
It seems so. However, this also raises questions about the potential impact of antibacterial mouthwashes, which could disrupt this process. Some studies have shown that chlorhexidine mouthwash, for example, can reduce nitrite levels and even slightly increase blood pressure.
Wow, so even something as simple as mouthwash can have unexpected effects.
It shows how interconnected everything is.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
The key takeaway is that the oral microbiome is a complex and dynamic ecosystem that's intricately linked to both oral and overall health. We're moving beyond simply fighting bad bacteria to understanding how to maintain a healthy balance.
It's about fostering a healthy relationship with our microbes.
Absolutely. And looking ahead, imagine a future where we could get personalized microbiome assessments as part of routine dental care.
So we could identify potential risks earlier.
Exactly. This could lead to more targeted strategies for maintaining a healthy oral microbiome, maybe even using prebiotics or probiotics to support beneficial bacteria.
That would be amazing.
It really is a brave new world of understanding the microscopic communities that live within us. So think about the implications of this for your own health and the future of dental care.
Food for thought. Thanks for taking us on this fascinating deep dive into the oral microbiome.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, keep those bacteria happy and balanced.
And don't forget to brush and floss.